but I'm with you more than in spirit. And welcome to the Surface Policy Dialogue series. Today we are moving closer to the elections. We are looking at debt, ZIDERA, and the elections. Tony Rila, my colleague, will moderate and introduce the panel. We'll be listening in from Accra. Good evening.
Thank you,
Tony.
Ibo. Yeah, hi. Good evening, everybody. How are you all? Can you see me? Can you hear me? David? Hi. Hello. Evening.
Yeah, we can hear you, Tony.
Good, good. Good evening, everybody. And welcome. We're discussing a fairly important topic tonight, and we're in the midst of what sometimes is the silly season in any country when elections happen. Well, all focus shifts to elections and only elections. So we're trying to tie a number of things together in an important way, because these are clearly crucial elections coming up, and they're crucial elections in a particular way, because we're looking at three aspects of it. One is this notion of debt restructuring, and I'll make a few comments about debt restructuring, and also the thorny problem that hangs over Zimbabwe's head all the time, the issue of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, passed by the US many, many years ago, and the relationship with the 2023 elections. Now, debt, quite clearly, has been a problem in Zimbabwe for a very, very long time. The problem of debt begins in the late 90s with the problems with the IMF and the World Bank and the economic policies at that particular time, the ex gratia payments that were made to the war veterans. And so it's been hanging over a very long time. But it was made infinitely complicated after 2000, and particularly after the fast-track land reform process, the elections in 2000 and 2002. And those led to a number of things. One was the passing of the United States Congress of the Zimbabwe Economic and Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which had some very specific conditions about political reforms and also conditions that were placed on debt and financial flows to Zimbabwe. And it was complicated also by all the problems around Zimbabwe's relationship with Cotonou, with the EU. And that's all led ultimately to a very long, complicated problem with sanctions. So what was, I think, very clear for a long time is that re-engagement was going to require two sets of reforms. One was going to be economic, and the second was political. And in fact, those begin to form the basis of a new initiative to try and help Zimbabwe get out of the economic mess that we're in and to get some political and international re-engagement. Now, this new strategy was laid out at the beginning of the year. And in the initial launch, Dr. Adesina from the African Development Bank made a very instructive statement. And so that we're clear what he said, I'm going to read that to you, right? He was talking about the setting up of a governance group, a governance working group. And as he said, the governance working group would allow us to tackle and make measurable progress on critical issues of freedom of speech, human rights protection, and the implementation of laws in line with the Constitution, as well as the implementation of the Motlanthe Commission of Inquiry and Compensation of victims. And we must show progress on the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA, all of which should make for peaceful, free and fair elections. They will also remove headwinds on our path to arrears clearance and debt resolution. Those are fairly blunt statement. And that appears to be the frame of this debt relief strategy. Now, of course, as you read that article, there's that statement, or hear that statement that I read out. It's very clear that it suggests a sequencing process, that the way the sequencing process is posed is reforms leading to elections. Now, the big question that we have to face here in 2023, and those of you who've been watching the Rao and Sappi's policy dialogues since August last year, is the question of elections. And which elections does this debt relief strategy anticipate being critical? Because it's very clear from all the work that's been done in these webinars and the comments made by everyone, that the reforms that Adesina was talking about are quite clearly not possible by August the 23rd this year. So are we talking about a future election, say 2028? And therefore, what is the issue? What will the elections in 2023 do to facilitate that reform process or impede it? So that's why we are linking three things together. Debt relief, ZIDERA, which by all understanding will also be a yardstick for measuring the success of those reforms, and of course the elections coming up and what will they bring. It's also important to note that this is not an isolated problem, and Joachim Chissano said a few weeks ago, he posed the problem of Zimbabwe not merely as a problem for Zimbabwe itself, but as a problem for the region. As he said, the crisis in the country is having terrible consequences for the region, as Zimbabwe lies at the heart of Southern Africa. So clearly we're dealing with it as a problem of both national and regional and international consequences. So we brought together a very erudite panel. Most of them have been on these policy dialogues in the past. Those of you who've seen the flyer will know who they are. We have a change of order of speakers. First and foremost will be Janet Joe, the director of ZimCod. Janet will outline what the debt relief strategy is. She's really going to do a descriptive job to say, this is what the intention is. And these are the details behind the debt relief strategy. Then we'll throw it open to Chinai Mutsambesere. She has been on here very often, a political economist, has had many things to say about debt and debt relief and complications about corruption. And she will then begin to offer her comments on what she understands as the debt relief strategy, its advantages and disadvantages. Then to Musa Kika, and he probably will begin to focus, given his background, much more on the governance aspects of this debt relief strategy. As you can see, governance aspects were highlighted, strongly indicated in the statement made by Dr. Adesina. And then we'll move back to Janet, having done her descriptive analysis of the debt relief strategy. She will now comment as an economist working on the issues of debt and debt relief, and her view of perhaps what this means for the citizens. So with those brief remarks, I'd like to hand over to Janet and for her to make her opening remarks. Thank you, Janet. Welcome.
Thank
Janet,
you very
you're
much.
muted.
Yes, I've just unmuted. Thank you very much, Tony, for this opportunity for us to have this conversation, and for SAPES for always organizing these policy dialogue platforms for us to discuss and actually have dialogue internally and connect to talk to very topical issues, I would say, that will be impacting and affecting us at any given time. And I think this is very timely. We are holding this after the nomination court. We want to try and frame this, of course, within the broader perspective of dialogue and negotiations that are going on in terms of resolving the Zimbabwe's debt crisis. But also noting that we have elections, and probably what does this mean? And I'm grateful that on the panel there is Chennai and there is Musa to really dig deeper into the specifics in terms of how this structured debt dialogue that's been going on in Zimbabwe can be that opportunity, probably, for us to begin to have discussions on strengthening our governance systems, and particularly focusing as well on electoral reforms. I know that elections are just around the corner, and the dialogue process just began, so to speak, because it started in December and is still very early, but at least there is dialogue, and there may be that political will, if we can continue to dialogue and talk to each other, for us to at least deliver on the basics for us to have a free and a fair election. So I'll speak to the current process of the structured dialogue that's going on within the debt strategy that Zimbabwe launched through the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development sometime last year in 2022. And that process involved some consultations, and the AFDB, the Africa Development Bank team, was in and out of Zimbabwe on virtual platforms trying to come up with the debt strategy. And the debt strategy, the current debt strategy that we are therefore implementing, is focusing on finding a resolution to clear the arrears, Zimbabwe's debt arrears, external debt, and that's to the World Bank, to the Africa Development Bank, and probably as well engage with its bilateral creditors. We know that Zimbabwe has a debt of over 17 billion, and out of that, about 7 billion of it is actually in arrears. This is why we say we are in debt distress, because we cannot, we have not been able to pay. What we have done is only to pay token payments that we resumed in just recent years. Otherwise, we had stopped altogether. So we need to resolve that issue of the arrears that we have, so that we can begin a conversation about debt relief, probably then get a package like other countries that have gone through different international financial institutions or the IMF packages, or we call for debt cancellation in whichever form that it comes. So I just wanted to clarify that the current strategy really is to deal with the arrears clearance, so that we can begin to talk about a debt relief package for Zimbabwe. So there are various options that the strategy offers in terms of how to clear the debts. It could be bridging finance, trying to negotiate for restructuring. Those are some of those strategies that it is proposing to engage the creditors on. So I just wanted to be clear that that is what is going on. And so within the strategy, then there is the structured dialogue platform that the government committed to establish, and to ensure that we begin to have internal conversations, but that are multi-stakeholder, that involves the government itself, the private sector, civil society, the creditors, and many other players in the economic governance and also the land aspects, and we'll get to that at some point. So the structured debt dialogue process actually began in December 2022. It was chaired or led, there are two facilitators. One, I believe, for that political understanding of the negotiation. We have the former president of Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano, and we also have the AFDB president, Adesina, who is an economist, who has led and championed various economic reforms at the African level, and some of it as well from the Nigerian perspective, having been a minister of agriculture, would understand the different dynamics when it comes to reforms and to having better standing. So those are the two facilitators that are there, and facilitated that they be the dialogue platforms. And so far, December 2022, March 2023, May 2023, there have been dialogues that have gone on. Then in between those three, the working groups that have also been working around matrices for the 3 pins or pillars that were identified for the structured debt dialogue. And those are one around economic reforms, the other one is on governance reforms, and one on land tenure reforms. So those are the 3 pillars, and they are working groups that have got chairs and co-chairs that are working on, that worked on developing and coming up with the matrices that are being used, that have got all the actions, issues that have to be dealt with, including the indicators and what we are going to say are the milestones, or we are actually getting there. So those also meet in between. And just to also highlight that civil society has done a lot of work in terms of trying to engage on all 3 as well, but particularly as well on the economic reforms and the governance reforms, noting the shrinking civic space and what has been obtaining in the context, and also noting that it's an election year, but I'm sure Musa will speak to that. But this is a very significant, I would say, process in terms of a national dialogue, which brings with it a great opportunity for Zimbabweans to find each other, but also for Zimbabwe to find itself in the international community, because it would have addressed some of the key challenges that have been highlighted by the international community. It gives Zimbabwe an opportunity to deliver as well to its citizens, because if we can find a permanent solution that we come up with together from our various sectors, from our various positions that we're coming from, there is a possibility that we may actually come up with resolving the debt conundrum that we currently actually face. So Zimbabwe will be able, when I'm saying Zimbabwe, I mean the government, will be able to deliver on public services. It will be able to actually have national resources. It will deal with a whole lot of the macroeconomic challenges that we have faced. We talk about corruption, we talk about lack of transparency, we are talking about reliance on resource-backed loans. All these issues, if we could give a proper, genuine dialogue on this aspect, could actually deliver for the Zimbabweans who have really languished in poverty, extreme poverty, inequalities, and lack of basics for quite for over 2 or 3 decades now. So I think the hope really of the dialogue process rests in that people are coming in a room. There's goodwill. from the creditors, believing as well in the facilitators that we have in terms of their key competences, and that probably that goodwill could actually be seized and used by the government and the people of Zimbabwe to actually find each other. And the pillars as well, I think they kind of give us some hope that we have managed to identify the sticky spots that we need to deal with. I spoke about the economic reforms, the governance reforms, and the land tenure reforms. And Tony, you highlighted the ZIDERA as an example. All these issues are there in the ZIDERA, but we also have our own, not finding each other based on these issues, and highlighting that these are really key reforms or 3 pins that could deliver probably on a resolution of the debt crisis, but on the many other issues that we haven't been able to see eye to eye, even as Zimbabweans, or have not been able to talk about as Zimbabweans. I think is a great opportunity that the dialogue process provides, but we need to seize it with that reverence and political will that is required for us to deliver, because there have been so many other strategies to clear the arrears that actually we fumbled on and failed to seize and to unlock the resolution to the debt crisis. So I'll just give examples, just rushing through so that we can move to the next session. On the economic reforms, it speaks to issues around market determined dealing or resolving the exchange rate issue, and ensuring that there is established a market determined exchange rate. And as we speak, we have seen quite a lot in the recent past, the past 2-3 weeks, where the exchange rate just went off the rail and started snowballing at such a rate. So we need to, the matrix on the economic reform speaks to this, and it has got its own indicators, and what we'd want to see is more action around that. Tied to that is the ending of quasi-fiscal operations by the Reserve Bank. And we know there has already been an SI for the Treasury to take over all the RBZ external debts, and that it is not going to do to be acquiring debts. So that SI is one that we may also need to discuss. We have issues in terms of just assumption of debts from the RBZ. It has happened in the past, but we said we need conversations around that. But ending quasi-fiscal operations is one of the top priorities actually that has to be. So it's positive in that regard, but we need to see and establish a framework in terms of how that is done, so that we also don't assume odious or illegitimate debts. It speaks to tightening monetary policies and having sound fiscal management, which are very practical issues that we need to deal with when we're talking about discipline and dealing with macroeconomic issues. It speaks to revenue collection, expenditure management, and improved public service delivery, which also is key. And we have issues to look at there, including resource leakages, underperforming parastatals and state-owned enterprises, value for money when it comes to service delivery, infrastructure development, and so forth. It also speaks to availability of social protection, but I'm sure I'll come back to this when I give my short remarks in terms of how I feel about this process and some of the indicators and what has been set out to be done. So which is a positive thing if we can have social protection, because these reforms mean a lot in terms of people's livelihoods. It speaks to the staff monitored program. We know that Zimbabwe has gone through staff monitored programs before with the IMF, but we are still here. But there's a proposal. One of the key things is when we've done all these reforms, we'll go through a staff monitored program. But this staff monitored program is going to be different from the previous ones where Zimbabwe was not getting resource. It's calling for complementary investments, particularly in the social sector, so that people can cope with the reforms, particularly as we tighten our belts and tighten the fiscal space to ensure that there is discipline. It speaks to land tenure. The issues of land tenure have been a sticky issue, a thorn in the flesh, and it needs to deal with this, honoring, resolving the BIPA commitments, ensuring that we deal with the bankability and transferability of the land that most currently possess after the fast-track land reform and so forth, and also resolving. Remember, we have that global political agreement with former commercial farmers of 3.5 billion. It also all comes in there to resolve all those sticky issues, including land audits, which eliminates multiple farm ownership and the like. Then we come to the governance, where I think key issues come out there, enhancing justice delivery, increasing public sector transparency and accountability, helping in combating corruption, which really has become, it's grand corruption, it's kleptocracy, it's in whichever way you may decide to describe it based on your experiences. It speaks to promotion of human rights. It speaks to electoral reforms, national unity, peace, and reconciliation. So these are all noble and very big and bold commitments that the government has made, that everyone is, including the facilitators, taking themselves through ensuring that these are implemented. We'll come to the gaps within it, I'm sure, as we do come back. But these are the key issues that, if they were addressed, we will deal with issues that we have seen in terms of the deterrent of investments in Zimbabwe, the weakening of economic growth, the undermining of the rule of law, leakages of public resources and money, that has really affected disproportionately the poor and vulnerable. So it would also eliminate impunity. I think we've seen from where we are coming from various reports, including documentaries, that are really speaking to how resources are being looted, but nothing being done. So there's an impunity component that could be dealt with if we were to address some of the indicators and the actions that have been set out in the 3 matrices that do cut across. So I would say, Tony, this gives us an opportunity, and colleagues that are also listening in, it gives us an opportunity to clear our debt arrears, and then move towards what kind of debt relief do we want, so that we are eligible, because at the moment we cannot talk about that. And the AFDB president has taken it upon himself to assist Zimbabwe do that. And there is also the facilitator, His Excellency Joachim Chisano, has also said they would want to facilitate that dialogue that will lead us to a debt relief package, hoping that will also perform well within the staff monitored program. So from the engagements that have so far gone on outside the high-level debt dialogue platform, has been steps already that are taking place. The government has already started developing the staff monitored program, hoping that it will be delivered and probably signed by October 2023. We go through that staff monitored program. But the request of the government is that it be a wet staff monitored program, which means it to be saying there's need to invest in the social sector, education, health, social protection to cushion the citizens and all. So we'll see then how this, at the spring meetings, if this is going to be signed or approved, as it will be submitted by the government. But it gives that opportunity for us to talk arrears clearance, debt restructuring, and then coming up with a package then of saying how are we going to access probably new credit lines. But there's still a lot that that has to be done by Zimbabwe, particularly to ensure that the reforms that we have said we'll implement, we actually do implement them. I would say at this point, Tony, let me pause there. I will come back, as you have said, with probably my critical eye to the process, but I just wanted to highlight the process and the opportunities that it gives, and also the processes that have been going on. The three high-level debt dialogue platforms, the working groups having been meeting, civil society also engaging on various platforms to ensure that we seize this moment of dialogue and ensure that it gives us results, not only for the arrears clearance, but sorting out our context, honestly, so that we live in peace, we live in harmony, prosperity, and inclusive development. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Janet. It's a very complex document, having seen some of it anyhow, to summarize, and I think you've done that very, very well. Just a couple of points of clarification. Some people may not be aware of that. You talked about a wet staff monitoring problem. I presume that's the opposite of a dry staff monitoring program, but maybe you could just say something briefly about that. Secondly, to what extent are the indicators cast in stone? Is there likely to be dialogue between all the stakeholders about what are the most useful indicators? Because indicators can be very high level, they can also be very grounded in citizens' perspective. And then I suppose the third point, and this goes back to Dr. Adesina's initial comments and his reference to ZIDERA. To what extent is ZIDERA, if you want, a external benchmark on the adequacy of the strategy? In other words, to what extent does the strategy have to meet the conditions of ZIDERA for the United States to be interested? If you could just clarify those three things very quickly.
Thank you very much, Tony. So previously we have been implementing the dry staff monitored program, as you have said. So Zimbabwe, or the government, would set out the reforms in terms of fiscal consolidation, fiscal discipline, eating what we kill, without reaching out or receiving any complementary investments to support those reforms. So it will be dry, and we'll be using our domestic resources for that, for all the reforms that we'll be implementing. But under the one that they are proposing that there be a wet staff monitored program. This means that they are calling on development partners to support certain sectors, so that as reforms are being implemented, there is funding to ensure that those reforms are successful, but they also don't bite as much on the citizens. They've actually highlighted, I think, 5 areas where they are calling for what they're calling complementary investments from development partners, and they are engaging on this. This I know includes the support to the education sector, support to the health sector, support to the social security sector as well. And 2 more. I just can't quite remember what those 2 are, but there are 5 sectors that they have said they would want. I think one of them is also around climate, the climate adaptation and issues like that. So they've identified sectors where they are calling for complementary investments. This could come probably as public-private partnerships, or as aid, or as donations, or as loans of some sort, so that those sectors that are going to be impacted the most by the reforms get resources or investments. So it becomes waiting that they are also saying we'll be implementing a staff monitored program with reforms, but we need to be talking about bringing resources. So it's looking at external resources coming in to complement or to support the implementation of those reforms. Then on the indicators have been signed. They were drafts when we went for our May meeting, for the March high-level debt dialogue forum, and the signing was in the May one. So they are, but discussions have continued. I was in a discussion where civil society, heads of states, heads of coalitions and network convened a meeting, and we were actually interrogating the matrices, the 3 matrices. And there is opportunity as well within the working groups to refine and to prioritize those indicators and what has been set out to do. But what I would say is that all of them are important, but prioritization can still happen. Engagement with the working groups is still open. We have a number of interventions that we have done from the civil society perspective, especially around the governance pillar, noting that there was the PVO bill, the elections coming, the shrinking civic space or democratic space, all those. We have tried to engage and have refinements around that. And as well, the context continues to change and certain steps being taken that calls for engagement and for us to interrogate the indicators. And the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development in that meeting actually said they're still open to us making contributions around those indicators and see how they work and are prioritized. On the ZIDERA as a benchmark. So if you look at it, most of the issues that are the 3 pins are speaking to actually issues that are in the ZIDERA. So just depending with where one is sitting, you may want to tick the boxes using the ZIDERA as a benchmark, but you could actually use these matrices, which is why probably we need to talk about creating a platform to monitor these 3 matrices that have been given as civil societies, the different players and actors, in terms of then ticking and saying this has been done and how has it been done, both at the quantitative and at the qualitative level. Because I think those are the questions that we also need to be asking ourselves, that as we implement these reforms, what's the quantity, but what's also the quality of those reforms. So such spaces, I think, are going to be required. But yeah, ZIDERA is actually probably one of the benchmarks, because most of the issues that it speaks to are the ones that are also highlighted in the reforms matrices that have been shared, and I'm sure you also just share them if you do, even in the chat box, just for those who may not have seen them. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, let's move now to the discussions. And we've had a very nice rollout of what's involved in all of this. Now we move much more to comments and views on this. And Janai, welcome. Nice to have you back.
Thanks, Tony.
I'm sure you've got some views about this, so please go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. That was a very, very comprehensive submission from Janet in terms of the current state of debt in Zimbabwe, a lot to process and understand. So what I thought I would do, Tony, today, because like you said, we have had the discussion around debt in Zimbabwe and, in terms of the levels of it, the arrears, and what is happening. What I want to point to today is, what does it tell us about Zimbabwe? What does it tell us about our treasury? What does it tell us really about our policy and state of play in Zimbabwe? Because debt in itself, Tony, as I'm sure most would agree, like, it's a necessity, right? You go to, I was looking at the OECD list of countries, the highest with external debt, Japan, 236%, America is at 126% of their GDP is debt. So the question is not only the level of debt in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, I think, is about 99%. I think that's what we're expecting it to be at by 2024. It's not so much the level of debt, it's also the quality of debt and what is happening, underneath the bonnet with regards to debt. And I just really wanted to kind of shed some light with regards to that. When the current government in Zambia, when they started to address their debt question, one of the statements they came up with, which I quite liked, was the presence of reckless lending and reckless borrowing. And I think the last, since independence, Zimbabwe has been subjecting itself to reckless borrowing with reckless lenders. As we know, we've not been able to borrow from the IMF for a while. We have relied instead on new or other bilateral partners, whether it's through the India Exim Bank, the China Exim Bank, Africa's Exim Bank, etc. And as we start to actually understand the type of debt arrangements we are getting into, this does highlight quite a lot of things that already Janet has talked about, the fact that 7 billion worth of our debt is arrears. So with it being arrears, this is non-productive debt. This is money that you're now just having to pay out, but is doing nothing for you at this point because it's arrears. And it's continues to grow because we can't afford to obviously pay off the principal sum. So recently, we've seen the SI that stated that Treasury will now be adopting the RBZ debt balance. And for me, this was extremely irresponsible in the sense that we should have seen Treasury actually taking time to understand how does the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe owe at least 37% of our debt. What has happened through there, and we know there's been a lot of quasi-fiscal activities that have been happening in the central bank. 37%, I think this was as at December 2021, so possibly that figure is now more. This is the other thing, is the very blind spot that is debt. We've been calling for an external public debt audit, none has been forthcoming. But we know from the public debt statements, for instance, that the RBZ has been participating in assuming private debt. So this is where individuals, private companies, they've borrowed, and the RBZ has taken on the position of guarantor and eventually has had to assume this debt. I mean, it's unethical to require the Zimbabwean taxpayer to go out and be responsible for paying off the debt of another private individual. And we've been asking, why was this decision made? Where is the legality around these sorts of decisions? And to what end? So, what does it mean? We've now adopted this into the national budget. Clearly, if we are to pay it off, this money is going to have to be allocated away from something that is actually a key requirement by Zimbabwe, a country with more than 49% in extreme poverty. So I really felt that that was very irresponsible from the Ministry of Finance to just adopt that without, we should have seen him actually investigate. We should have seen him at least say, okay, these deadlines where we are going to adopt because we can follow through and see what they were used for as a country and their contribution to social welfare or whatever, or economic development. But instead, we know that there are some private debts in there that have been assumed as part of this instrument. The type of lending, as well as I've said, I've pointed to reckless lenders, right? So, and I will give an example, which is what we've seen with the DECA project that was funded from a loan from the India Exim Bank, right? I think initially this was 29 million. But what we have seen since is that this loan has since been increased to almost 60-something million US dollars. Why? Because the Indian contractors that we had to use in order to produce the project, they said, no, you need more. Twice we had to inflate the original figures to meet their requirements. And yet, so we borrowed from India. We've then used this money to pay off an Indian contractor. And because what has then happened is, whilst we've got this, I think we got the money in 2013. The project, I don't think started till about 2020, 2021 properly. So all this while we are incurring interest on a project that hasn't started, but instead what we have done with that loan in part is to pay off the arrears on other projects. And I've taken this statement from the 2021-22 debt statement, which said, the law disbursements, these are the disbursements made to the DECA project, are due to accumulation of arrears on projects such as the Victoria Falls, which we owe to the China Exim Bank, the Net1 network expansion, the China Exim Bank, Tel1 backbone network and broadband access to the China Exim Bank. So we have diverted disbursements that we were supposed to be paying against that loan to pay off our old age debt. So, you know, and what's left is then used in India because of this overinflated contract. No one has gone in to say, but where is the moral hazard? This is a moral dilemma. You're lending us money and insisting that we use one of your contractors and then overinflating the price on top of that. So this is the type of irresponsible borrowing that has brought us where we are. And why it's a problem is because it's non-productive. If even we were actually using the money that we borrowed to deliver against projects in a very timely, in a way that we are aware of what the payback period is, we are aware of what the return on investment is, and we timed it in this way, one, we would not have the arrears, but also we would be having a multiplier effect, a return on that investment that would make it almost worthwhile to a certain degree. But this is not what we are seeing in Zimbabwe. We are borrowing from Jenny to give to Peter, but Jenny and Peter, both of them, none of them are in Zimbabwe. So we don't even have the multiplier effect of the fact that when we borrow this money is deposited somewhere in our central bank, and then we're going to take from there, whatever. This money is being borrowed and being used to pay offshore. So it doesn't even, in some ways, another way to visualize it, it doesn't actually even leave India. We borrow this money, they keep it, and we are paying it back when we pay back the principal. We're paying it back when we pay back the arrears, and we are paying it back when we pay off the contractors. So they make a 3 times return on what they lend to us. And then, so you're seeing all these in terms of the quality of borrowing that is happening in Zimbabwe. We saw what happened with the treasury bills in is it 2016, 2017, where when they did the bond notes, it was all converted at 1:1, and somebody, a private individual, made a killing through that. And this was through the Reserve Bank. And today, the same is going to be paid off, using taxpayers' input. And so this is what I want to try and highlight, to say that it's also the quality of debt that is the problem in Zimbabwe. Can we trace back to the usefulness of what we have borrowed? Where is that money? Why does it take us? I think we've had situations where, I think Wange Colliery was another one, where we borrowed, but we are, since we borrowed the money, actually we get less productive gains from the project. So how is that possible? If we have increased the capital, we increase the level of investment into a particular asset, we are getting less gains from it, from that period. So, and these are the nuances around the debt in Zimbabwe that we really need to shed a light, and the public debt audit would do well to break down and to help us understand what has happened with this money. How well is it aligned to corruption and other misdemeanors that are going on through the central bank and through Treasury? When we come to the issue of ZIDERA, which some might say is problematic, because maybe if we are to address the ZIDERA, it does mean that we get access to better quality debt that is better monitored, that is, so partners, perhaps such as the IMF, would have more interest in actually monitoring how the money that they've lent to us is used, unlike what we are seeing with other bilateral partners. So the ZIDERA is very important. And we look at, and this is where I think the issue of political will especially comes to play, because if the current government is intent on actually doing something about this problem, then we should be seeing some movement, in terms of the ZIDERA requirements. They should at least be arguing back, not just to say this is terrible, but look, we're doing all these efforts to get things right, therefore we should be pardoned, therefore at least, give us. But when I looked at the ZIDERA requirements, I personally cannot see any movements. You look at the first one, which is talking about the rule of law has been restored in Zimbabwe, including respect of ownership and title to property, freedom of speech and association, and an end to the lawlessness, violence, and intimidation. And we are not seeing this. There's no political will for this to change. You know, the likes of Job Sekala, Jacob Garivume are still evidence of the fact that there is really zero movement on this. With regards to property rights, we still have the same problem that we've been talking about in terms of the land tenure in Zimbabwe and property rights. We continue to observe infringement on property rights through certain statutory instruments. For instance, the one that at the moment that was being argued between the Treasury and the central bank on the retention of deposits, you know, that to me is an infringement of property rights. There's nowhere else in the world you go where you put your money in the bank and a bank manager can just decide to convert it or take it or whatever. You know, that is daylight robbery, and it's an infringement on property rights. You look at what is happening in mining and the property rights issue there's been no change. You know, so we've had very little rumblings and yet no outcomes. So there's no political will with regards to that. They talk about the government of Zimbabwe has demonstrated a commitment to an equitable, legal, and transparent land reform. I think this is still hanging in the balance. Every now and again, you will still hear that somebody has attempted or has successfully grabbed somebody else's farm, etc., etc. These are issues that in 2023, you know, 43 years after independence, it should no longer be a thing. It should not be. We should not expect to open the newspaper or to go on social media and find that somebody is grabbing somebody else's farm, and there's no end. There's no resolution with regards to that. In terms of you know, I mean, we can talk and perhaps the other speakers will highlight this in terms of the governance around property rights. You know, we're still very much inadequate with regards to that. The implementation of the 2013 Constitution, whilst I myself am not a constitutionalist, I know from what I'm seeing through the statutory instruments, there's so many. We've seen presidential pronouncements, we've seen so many SIs that have not gone through Parliament. They've just been declarations on Twitter, you know, and where does the 2013 Constitution stand if there is the possibility and the reality that we are seeing of these pronouncements, you know? So there's very little that you can try to say, well, maybe there's a little bit of political will to do something about this, you know. And I mean, the list goes on in terms of commitment to reforming Zimbabwe. We've seen the corruption in investigations that have gone on, and we have been perplexed by the very little effort that has come from the central bank in terms of the financial intelligence unit. Very little that they've done to try and investigate, to try and redress the corruption issues that have been highlighted by external journalists. You know, it's been really quite mind-blowing, the extent to which they've really not bothered to do something about that. You know, we see the role of state security coming up, the Zimbabwean Armed Forces, the National Police of Zimbabwe, and their role.
2 minutes, please, Chennai.
Okay,
2 minutes.
so I mean, I'd like to just quickly say in terms of potentially, you know, looking at ways forwards to address. I know Janet spoke to the possibility of bridging finance, you know, but even that relies on reform. We cannot start to talk to private investors when we still have issues on property rights, when we still have issues around predictability in terms of our regulations, you know, when we still have issues in terms of our infrastructure projects and to the extent to which they're investable. So overall, I would say a critical key success factor in terms of debt relief and debt and the way forward in Zimbabwe really relies a lot on governance and governance reform. And I think possibly that's probably a good place for me to stop as I hand over to the next discussant. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm sure there was a lot more you had to say. I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said, and it struck me in civil society stakeholders meeting. We're talking about debt, and I don't think any of us know what the extent of the debt is. who's it to, how much is it, etc., is a critical issue for the credibility of this debt relief story, that we have a full and transparent declaration of what exactly our debt is. I mean, 9 decimal point disclosure of what, who, and how. Well, at least what and who.
I think this is very important, Tony, because even in terms of negotiations, so we can't, for instance, be talking to IMF about debt relief when we owe just as much to China or just as much to India, because the debt relief might come, but it will not be expressed in our realities because we still owe just as much elsewhere, if not more, So it's such an important question in terms of the extent of the public debt in Zimbabwe. The detail is very critical. And the fact that there is a lack of transparency with regards to this already indicates that there are perhaps some misdemeanors that we will find, if ever we can access, that bonnet and really start to unpick it. So that in itself is a big problem. I can't see us realistically being given debt relief without being transparent in terms of what our public debt status is, what we owe, whom we owe it to, etc.
Very much answered one of my questions. Thank you. So thank you for unpacking a lot of the issues around the economy and also sliding into the next area, which you raised, I think, very clearly, the problems around governance. And now I'd like to move to Musa and ask him to his views about the debt relief strategy. Musa, over to you, Boix.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you, colleagues. I have to apologize in advance. I won't be able to put on my camera because of where I am. But I'm privileged to be coming after 2 eloquent speakers, more qualified than I, to speak to the subject of debt and arrears clearance, the process that we are currently engaged in. So I would want to pick up from where Chennai left, and she raised some really interesting points, some of which I'll make passing references to. But I want to speak in particular to the pillar of governance, one of the 3 sector focus areas that this process is looking at. And I want to start on the point of elections. Both the African Development Bank President Adesina, as well as President Chisano, when they addressed the high-level gathering on 15 May this year, they both spoke of elections as a low-hanging fruit, as the first test of sincerity on the part of Zimbabwe, Zimbabweans, and our government in this process. And it wasn't just them. It was also some of the sovereign lenders and multilateral lenders who were at the table who also said the same. So these elections that we are jumping into this August are pretty much going to be the yardstick through which we are going to be measured on whether we are sincere, we are genuine, and we are really intent on a reform process. And the question now is, will Zimbabwe pass this test? Only time will tell. Already we have been having a series of challenges around these elections, but it's up to us, it's up to the authorities that are managing elections in Zimbabwe to make sure that we deliver a free, fair, and credible election. The second point I want to make related to that is that the point here is, and has always been, that it's the politics and not the economics. You look at the 3 sectors that this process is focusing on. Governance sector reforms is the sector with the most indicators, the most extensive indicators of the 3 areas. And that's not by coincidence. It speaks to the centrality of governance in this entire process. You cannot have economic prosperity without good governance. But even if one were to assume or believe that it's possible to have economic prosperity without good governance, and give an example, the Asian tigers, and say there's economic prosperity without much political liberties, etc. The point is we are not equivalents. The conditions that we have are different. They have been different, and they will remain different until we fix our own local set of variables. The second point is that politicians who are at the center of our governance must be controlled. And that is why we have a concept of limited governance, of rule of law, checks and balances. And this is why these things are so important. These are captured in our constitution. And in the context of Zimbabwe, political power has always been a means to an end, a way to access and plunder resources. That is what we have seen as a pattern over the years. We have economic networks in Zimbabwe which are based on patronage and cartel networks. We now have several publications, broadcast and print, that are providing evidence, or at least some smoke, over the extent of these cartels and patronage systems. And you have impunity in all that. And that is impunity which is, in my view, enabled deliberately by limiting the capacity and ability of our institutions to do their work. So we would have an institution like the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, but it will do nothing because the powers that be actually do not want it to work. That's a governance issue, not an economic issue, which is why we say, look, governance at the end of the day is underlying all this. The entities that are supposed to work to do their work, to make sure the economy is sound, functional, we are not falling into useless, low quality debt. Those institutions are limited in their capacity and ability to do their work because they are not being allowed to deliberately. Those are shortcomings in governance. And I spoke about the Anti-Corruption Commission. It reminds me of Michaela Wrong's publication, Our Turn to Eat, looking at Kenya, where John Gitongo explains that when he was appointed as the anti-corruption chief in Kenya at that time, he started actively fighting corruption, but he later realized he had missed the memo because the memo was for him to pretend to fight corruption and not to actually fight corruption. And when he started fighting corruption, he ended up being on the run himself. That is just a classic example of the situation that we find here, whether you speak of the courts, whether you speak of the Anti-Corruption Commission, whether you speak of the prosecution, etc., etc. So ineffective institutions that we have, governance institutions, which are supposed to be controlling how the economy functions, are ineffective by design. And we will not have a strong central bank, strong institutions, a strong Auditor General's office, strong courts, a strong ZEC, strong parastatals, you name it, for as long as we do not have the right political intent and will to make this work. For now, it does appear like the will that is there is to maintain the status quo for nefarious reasons, of course. And all what this means is that it's impossible to solve the economic challenges that we have without dealing with the governance question. And then the third issue I want to mention is that we must treat the problem as opposed to the symptoms, right? The debt that we have has accumulated, including the arrears that we have as a result of indiscipline, abuse of resources, leakages, we have corruption, we have a deficit in checks and balances, we have been overriding legal and procedural safeguards, there has been misprioritization, lack of accountability, etc., etc. This is why we have this kind of unproductive debt that we have, arrears added to that, right? The point being, even if we solve the debt issue, the current 17+ billion debt issue that we have, and we get, be it debt cancellation, restructuring of payment terms, etc., etc. What we would have done is to just treat the symptoms and not the problems, right? We will find ourselves in a vicious cycle where we get more debt and we fall in the same problems. Like part of what is really driving this process is, well, we want to get good with the creditors so that we can get more debt, right? And Chennai spoke quite interestingly about the issue of quality of debt, right? So we keep having ourselves caught up in this vicious cycle of low quality debt, and then arrears, and then you clear, and then you go through it again, etc. So the correct and prudent thing to do would be to fix the real problem. And the real problem here is governance deficits, right? So in addition to the governance sector, you have the economic reform sector, you have the land tenure reform sector. Look, when you look at what has given rise to land reform redress issues, it's because the process was chaotic. Why? Because there was disregard of process, there was disregard of law, there was disregard of institutions, right? The courts at that point spoke, but we chose to disregard them, right? Entities running the economy would see what this whole chaotic land reform process was leading to, but all that was being disregarded, right? That was enabled and facilitated by overriding the safeguards that we have in terms of our institutions, law enforcement processes, etc. In fact, we weaponized those institutions, law enforcement processes, the courts, to achieve what we wanted to achieve. And here we are today, seeking to engage in land tenure reform. Same with the economic challenges that we are having, right? Institutions of government interfering with market forces, market processes, corruption and leakages, enabled to take root over the years because our authorities, our institutions, which are supposed to stop this, turned a blind eye or facilitated this, right? And all this has been enabled by the capture of state institutions, right? You look at issues of capital flight, right? The economy is not performing as it is supposed to. Foreign direct investment is not as good as it is supposed to. Thanks. I'll be rounding up shortly. That is all a result of bad governance, disregard of rule of law, disregard of institutions, which at the end of the day result in a situation where there is insecurity of investments. And who would want to be in that kind of space? And Chennai spoke about assumption of debt, including private debt. How does that happen? It happens because institutions of government, which are supposed to provide a check to that, are not playing their role because they have been emasculated, because there is disregard of constitutionalism, right? So governance is top priority. Then the final point that I'll raise, Tony and colleagues, has to do with the opportunities that this process provides us. In my view, if there is sincerity on the part of government to really engage meaningfully in this process to its logical conclusion, we might have before us an opportunity to reform. This is the first time, in my view, that we are seeing something which looks like broad-based dialogue in Zimbabwe, where national reform is on the national agenda. We have tried dialogue before in some forms, but mostly it has been elite political pacts. But this is the first time that we are having many stakeholders coming to the table to discuss a national reform agenda, right? So the issue is, if we really are sincere about this, it might be an opportunity to get Zimbabwe on the right path. Granted, there are still concerns at the moment in terms of, for instance, absence of certain players, constituencies at the negotiating table, but that can be rectified. I must also say, this is the first time that I have seen official acceptance that what we have at the moment in Zimbabwe is a crisis. And that term was actually used a number of times in these engagements. So we have an opportunity before us, provided there is sincerity. Thanks, Tony, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Musa. You raise a lot of issues for which I have many questions, but I'll save them when we have a round. I'd like to now go back to Janet. You did a wonderful job of giving us what we could say is the objective reality. Now I'd like to hear from you about your subjective reality, your professional view of what you think is going on. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony, and to Chennai and to Musa. I think they have really done a fantastic job in terms of critiquing the process and also poking the holes into it, in as much as it could be actually used as an opportunity for dialogue that is very broad-based and that covers the critical areas that we need to deal with. I think it can be viewed as that opportunity, but it's going to take being genuine, being sincere, and also the political will to actually go, all the way when it comes to some of the reforms that have been called for. And I would say that it's going all the way in that you cannot provide or go on half-bagged actions and expect to see the change. So if we are going to implement these reforms, it means we have to be very genuine and we have to go all the way in ensuring that we cross all the T's and we put all the dots on the I's. So I think that is where I would want to start from and say that once again, we have had quite a number of debt strategies, talk of the ZARs, the Lima, so many of them have actually come different strategies. We're implementing one strategy that actually ended, that came with the transitional stabilization program, I'm sure. It came to an end and we have a new one that has brought us the dialogue that we're talking about. But just to highlight that, probably I'll also hazard in 3 or 4 areas. One, I've spoken about the issue of the goodwill in the room. But we know that we also have a history of just squandering that goodwill. So when you see the creditors, when you see the private sector, civil society willing to engage, including the facilitators coming on board to engage on the issue, it means that people are willing to engage with the government of the day and ensure that there is resolution to the crisis that we are facing. So I'm just hoping that we won't squander that that opportunity, but go all the way in terms of implementing the reforms that we have asked for. And the second issue is that we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to fiscal transparency. And in the matrix, and I want to refer to the economic reforms one, it speaks of debt reconciliation in terms of understanding our debt stock. So they will do a reconciliation, who do we owe and all. But from my perspective and the organization that I come from, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, we've actually been calling for a more robust and thorough debt audit, where we're saying, let's get to know exactly how much we owe. We can even come to a point, there are disputes in terms of even the 17 billion that we are talking about. The people that will put it at 20 billion, that are putting it at 30 billion, at 30 billion. So just depending with where you're sitting and where you're coming from and what you're throwing in there, you can just come up with a different figure. But we use the official debt, but that is disputed. And when you listen to people that are bringing in the critique of the debt stock that we have, I think they have genuine points, because we need to improve on the transparency aspects of it, because we can put in the issue of resource-backed loans, we can put in the issue of the RBZ debts, some secret debts that we may not be able to really put a finger on. So the issue of the debt audit not coming out strongly, probably within the dialogue process, is a major flaw and weakness that I think we need to continue to highlight, that it was important for us to have an independent debt audit. Yes, the Public Debt Management Office, but what will be the role of Parliament in that debt audit? How do we go about interrogating issues of the quality of debt that have been referred to? Because for us, we go as further as saying there is definitely reckless lending and borrowing. There's also odious and illegitimate debts that we need to deal with and to talk about and be sincere about, so that those are cancelled. We remain with the debt that is legitimate, that passed through Parliament, that went through the whole legal framework that is set out in Zimbabwe. So if we can do that within the process, I think we'll have a genuine process. We'll show that we want to improve in terms of debt transparency, and it goes even to the whole fiscal transparency. Then there is the second issue within the debt dialogue process is the role of Parliament. For years, for the past 3 decades or so, we have seen Parliament being decimated in terms of its role, its oversight role. So the role of Parliament is relegated in the loan construction processes. We even saw an attempt at one point when the amendment number 2, the bill, the constitutional amendment bill number 2 back then, but which was then enacted, where actually powers were about to be taken from Parliament to oversee certain international agreements made by the president. So we continue to see that. Chennai, they've both as well spoken about SIs. We ruled by SIs. So relegation of Parliament in all these issues. The debt, the arrears debt that we're talking about, the debt that the Treasury assumed, it was assumed through an SI, never went through Parliament. So we need to also put this within the debt dialogue process and say, how are we going to strengthen the institution called Parliament to play its role? How are we going to strengthen our laws? The Public Finance Management Bill is still a bill. This Parliament is going to be going. It will leave it and it's lapsing, and we'll pick up the conversation once again. We're talking about resource-backed loans. We have a Mines and Minerals Bill that's going to lapse as well. So we need to talk the role of Parliament in all this. And the dialogue process is going on. I haven't really seen how it's prominent in the dialogue process as Parliament is that oversight, with that oversight mandate. Probably my third point, Tony, as I come to the conclusion, is that we are in an election year, and there's going to be definitely change of government. And by change of government, I'm not talking about anyone coming in or not, but that opportunity and chance that there's going to be a change of government would have meant probably really opening up the dialogue to have even, how our political parties that we probably know have a chance to be in Parliament, to be in Senate, and probably to even assume the presidency. How are they participating in the dialogue process? Because we have set out plans, matrices, indicators, and all, where they have not participated. In the governance pillar, there is really engagement with the Pollard process, but I don't know how that process is engaging within the debt dialogue platform. So that is also for me a major issue that I feel like. So after elections, when we have done our elections, we've selected our new leadership, we have a new administration, how is it going to continue to engage?
How is it
going to continue to engage in the processes? That's my third point. The fourth and last, I'm sorry, Tony, is that we're calling for reforms, economic reforms, to tighten, to bring about macroeconomic stability. We're appealing for a wet staff monitored program, but there is a fear and probably this token narrative that is this not an old script of ESAP, where we are going to continue to tighten our belts until we even break our waist as the citizens, but without really much change. And we will just find ourselves back in the same trap. So I think we need to also elevate and scale up the conversations within the platforms in terms of how is it different from the previous SAP. We saw this transitional stabilization program. It was doing fiscal consolidation. It is a few reforms. It introduced austerity measures, different taxes that we're taxing the citizens and all. So with where we are going, how are we going to ensure that the citizens are cushioned, social security issues are at the fore and at the core, and we really deal with leakages so that we have resources internally mobilized to cushion the citizens. So far, the staff monitored program that's being drafted and called the wet staff monitored program is heavily appealing and depending on the external donors to then bring in the complementary investments. But we need to be building our domestic resource base. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to deal with ensuring that we don't talk debt relief without social policy? I think it's a big issue. For me, a conversation around social policy when we are talking debt alternatives is a big issue that we should also have put in within this platform, so that we don't have, I'm sure now at my count, I'm like, is it SAP 4.0 that we must be anticipating? Because I know we have the SAP of the early 1990s. We have had the transitional stabilization program and many other measures that the government is implemented and introduced. And we are here once again, and we'll be implementing a staff monitored program if signed and approved in October 2023. How is that going to look like? How is that going to be to actually be different? So from that economic perspective, I just wanted to highlight that we need to tie in all the processes. It's from the land reform itself, the land tenure reforms, it's the governance itself. We are seeing the constitution still being disseminated. As we are speaking 2 days ago, there was another SI to amend the constitution actually, and not go to parliament, where it has changed, you know how elections, is it provincial councils? They being changed now from women, was supposed to be 10 women elected, it has changed to persons. 1 woman lead, next is men. So it has cut that to 5. So we need to be very genuine and true in terms of exactly where we are going, and move together and not squander the opportunity for us to find one another in these processes. So thank you, Tony. I'll hand back to you, the mic.
Thank you very, very much. Sheesh, you guys have raised infinitely more questions than answers about this. So you've raised a series of really critical things. One is about political will. Is this a serious process? You've raised, I think in some senses, the notion that this is once again something of an elite pact. It's being discussed at a very, very high level. And I think that's really important when you just raised, Janet, the notion that one of the consequences of this will be possibly yet another ESAP, and the dry component we will fund, and that will fall on the citizens who are in such a terrible place already. But the wet component is, of course, dependent on the interest and the, what's the right word for this? The conviction by development partners that this is a serious process. And it kind of raises all these issues about how serious is this process. But we framed this in 3 ways. We framed it as debt relief, ZIDERA as a external measure of this process, and then we talked about elections. Now, Musa raised the issue of elections as a low-hanging fruit. And for many of us in the middle of this election, we're very, very concerned. So I want to give you one anecdote, because I was part of a discussion where a very senior person pointed out that we should not set the bar too high for this process. And I'm concerned about that because it raised for me a couple of issues. Was there a sense in which this election is not fundamental to this this debt relief process? They're thinking of a medium-term process in which this election will come and go. And we can talk a little bit about the consequences of this election on the strategy. But secondly, there is also a very important notion that let me put it a different way, is the consequence that the elections will unravel the governance strategy. Musa talked about this in detail. Will demonstrate the complete lack of all the reforms that should have led to election. And already we have had many, many discussions about elections and deep concern about whether these elections can meet anything like best practice. So the question I'm really asking is the linkage between these strategies. Do we think that in a sense, people who involved in this, the stakeholders, don't care about this particular election and its consequences? So it's a general question, what is the consequence of this election? Should it be, like every election since 2000, yet another deeply disputed election? And what consequence does it have for debt relief? And throwing it open to each of you. Chennai, Janet, Musa, please come in as you feel. Just speak.
Well, Tony, are you talking in terms of a predetermined election outcome? In terms of if we see, for instance, what we saw in 2018, if that is repeated in 2023, I think well and truly, if that was to happen, then we can almost lock the door and throw away the key on the situation in Zimbabwe. We are in such a delicate position at the moment in terms of the geopolitical situation going on. There are a lot of opportunities within that, because obviously we have investors that are looking for a home with everything that is happening in Europe, with everything that is happening in America, etc. Of which Zimbabwe, being as resourceful as it is, there are clear opportunities there. So if we fail to gain the change in governance that is required, then I'm afraid, I think we will probably need to have this conversation again, perhaps in 20 years time from now, in the hope that, if you look at any economic cycles, at some point, I think I give it 20, 40 years again, perhaps, somebody, another Tony, another Chennai, another Janet will be set here trying to have the same discussions, So Zimbabwe really, really is in a situation where there's a desperation, and I would add to that, in that where we are now, we really require a new government. It would not be enough to have a change in the composition, perhaps in the National Assembly, without a change in the governance, without a change in the presidium. I don't see that, we'll be going backwards. I think we are at a place now where change is almost as necessary to us as oxygen for Zimbabwe to survive. We are just this week, I think we're having statutory instruments one a day. They're on Saturday. Somebody tagged me on Twitter where the president is actually now giving orders in terms of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. I mean, to what end? We have our institutions are so captured that even the banking system is being run by the president, you know, by a political entity. So this is very, very worrisome. The risk profile for Zimbabwe is worsening. So because what would happen if we were looking at it in terms of a balance, you know, we're trying to address the debt question, but we should equally be trying to address productivity. We should be equally trying to increase our national income, trying to reduce inequality gaps, because we need to be able to feed ourselves, right? It's no point getting debt relief and tomorrow you need to borrow again the same amount of money. We're in this perpetual cycle of zero economic development. So we really, really need to come to a place where we get a bit more autonomy so that our systems just work, so that we restore credibility in our economy, so that we reduce our risk profiling. And you will find that this debt situation will actually address itself, because that is how these things are meant to work. The reason why it's so topical for Zimbabwe is that it has become a handbrake, because there is no economic development and there is no other way forward other than to get some relief, because we cannot increase our own income. Our debt is not being used to improve our infrastructure to the extent that we require it to. So a change in governance is absolutely critical, because even I'm sure all of us will say the same, that we're almost tired. We sound like a broken record in terms of articulating the issues and problems that Zimbabwe faces and has faced for the last 43 years.
Thanks, Chennai. I mean, I asked this in an oblique way because we have elections. All of you have talked about the interaction between governance and economy. The loud question we haven't really addressed very much, but this package. Now, one of the things that struck me, I made this comment about low-hanging fruit and the notion of don't set the bar too high. One of the things I did after the encounter, the civil society dialogue, was I wondered about this notion that we're crafting a national strategy, an inclusive national strategy with stakeholders. And as Janet pointed out, this process began in 2022. And now we have a national strategy and we have an election. One of the things that rather shocked me, because I went and investigated this, was to what extent were the other political parties engaged in crafting this national strategy? Because you raised the issue of a change of government. Well, that's what elections are. They changes of regime. And my discomfort was that there seemed to be an assumption, and go back to the statement that don't set the bar too high, that with no consultation with opposition political parties and the major opposition political party, that the regard was that nobody cared about the result of this election. It was not in the mind of anybody that there could be a change of regime. Now, it struck me as odd that if you're crafting a national strategy, you're crafting a strategy that whichever government came into power would implement that strategy. So therefore, if there was a change of government, you have to start this entire process all over again, because there's been no consultation about it. I'm throwing it open to you, Janet, Musa.
Yeah, Tony, you are absolutely correct. It does appear there might not have been that thinking of what may be beyond this election. You are correct. I spoke earlier in my brief remarks about certain constituencies which are not on the table at the moment. One of those are political parties, and we have suggested that political parties are important. They must be represented in this process. At the very least, we need political parties who are in parliament to participate in this process. We are going to go into a phase of implementation, right, where these matrices now need to be implemented. And the government roadmap is going all the way to December 2025. Now, these reforms include a lot of law reform, and the center of law reform happens to be parliament. So you are going to need political parties represented in parliament to be part of this process, to understand what we are trying to do, so that when it comes to pushing through the necessary reforms in parliament, they are engaged. President Chisano spoke about what he called spoilers. He spoke about the need to make sure that we are not blind to what could be potential spoilers to this process. And in my view, not having the right constituencies that should be on the table is a potential spoiler. Because as you rightfully say, Tony, say we have an election and we have a change of government. Would the next government buy into this? Or they'll say, no, we were not involved. We are not part of this. We'll start our own clean process. You want to avoid those kind of processes. And you do that by anticipating what might happen, who may be needed, who will be needed in the implementation phase. This is captured in the form of a national dialogue, and it makes no sense to exclude certain constituencies. Over.
Thank you, Musa. Now, there's also this question of political will. Now, one of the things that was raised in the civil society consultation by one of our senior lawyers, and this speaks to a related issue to the one we've just been discussing, was the question of creating stakeholder interest. Now, this has been going on since 2022. And the question that was raised was, what do people think about the passing, but not signing, of the PVO bill and the Criminal Law Amendment Act and the Patriot section in it? What does that speak to political will? Because it seems to me that if you're bringing stakeholders in, and you want civil society to be engaged and interested and supportive of it, these are two pieces of legislation that speak to a real lack of political will and even a desire to hamstring and handicap civil society from participating. Now, we may assume that these are related only to the election, but they do speak to the notion of political will for engaging people in a broad national reformation process. I'd be interested in comments from you, Musa, but also from Janet and Chinak.
Thank you, Tony. I'll give it to Musa. You explain, of course, better, I am sure. But I can speak to some extent to the PVO bill, because together with Musa and other civil society leaders, we have engaged in this process and brought the PVO bill to the spotlight is that fly, on the wall when it comes to the structured debt dialogue process, and also already not in tandem with what is indicated and committed to in the governance matrix in terms of having people exercise the human rights, having freedom of expression, and ensuring that there is more civic and democratic space We raised this issue during the consultation processes with His Excellency, the President Joachim Chissano. We raised it to a point that the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, after the March dialogue, requested for civil society organizations to actually do written submissions in terms of why we were concerned about the PVO bill, which is something that we actually did and went further to engage, including engaging President E.D. Mnangagwa himself not to sign after that bill had passed in Parliament. It had been passed in Parliament, and we engaged thoroughly, and we've continued even in the civic spaces that we are creating to be spotlighting that we cannot have a PVO, this PVO bill being passed. And up to now, it hasn't been signed. And my thinking is that it's one of those bills that may actually lapse when this Parliament is dissolved. So it raises, what we were raising was actually that lack of political will, that we're talking about this, and we have this indicator in terms of improving when it comes to governance reforms, but we have laws that are not progressive, that are not showing us that we are taking those progressive steps. And we were highlighting the PVO bill as an example. And you have highlighted once again as well the criminal codification one, the patriotic bill that has been passed as well. And these are the, the dance that we continue to speak about and to spotlight and say, these do not show that there is political will. The SIs that we are talking about, amending the constitution through an SI without going to Parliament or without following due process when it comes to constitutionalism. So already we see that there is a question mark around the political will, and we wait to see all the other arrears clearance strategies. They actually failed because of political will to go all the way in terms of implementing reforms. So if we're going to do half-baked, like I said in the beginning, it means we're not going anywhere. It is still going to crumble. We are just wasting our time, and at the end of the day, we're going to find ourselves in the same spot. That is what I would actually say. This just shows that there isn't enough political will to go all the way, and the reforms need one to go all the way, because people cannot feel the pain for nothing. It's the same why we are so worried about ESA. So we feel the pain for what? At the end of the day, nothing is going to change. We're going to find ourselves in the same, if not worse, situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. Musa, Chennai, do you want to come in quickly before I start throwing it open to the floor?
Well, just one point on the issue of civic space. One thing that is beginning to throw questions around this process is the Patriot Bill. Why? Because the Patriot Bill was passed after this process had already taken off, and after commitments had already been done. And one of the targeted outcomes under the governance matrix is the promotion of civil society activities, your freedom of opinion and expression, your issues of civil society space. These are all things that are captured in those exact terms in the governance reforms matrix. When you then pass a law such as the Patriot Bill, and everyone who's on the table is looking at what you have committed, and there has been conversations about sincerity or lack thereof, it starts to get people to wonder and question whether we are not being used or we are actually pursuing something genuine. No one wants to be taken for a ride, including the creditors. I'm sure, including President Chissano and President Adesina. They don't want to be used to mask, what is a political process to manage, as opposed to actually achieving genuine reforms. So already we have the Patriot Bill, which is causing doubt. PVO Bill, we hope it won't be signed. There has been silence thus far, and we hope it's positive silence that that bill will lapse. And then the elections become, in my view, the bedrock of the entire process. If these elections don't deliver, that will seriously throw this entire process in jeopardy. If those elections deliver, then we are talking, then we are on the right track. So in my view, you had asked earlier, Tony, whether these 2023 elections are really, of any impact or effect to this process. And the answer is yes, because there's electoral reforms as a specific standalone outcome area in the governance matrix. And if these elections don't deliver, then I think the message would have been sent clear that there is no interest, because everything else around governance and systems and processes is anchored on what comes out of these elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Musa. Okay, I'd like to throw the floor open at this moment. I see my comrade in Accra is here. I wondered whether he had some observations or some comments. Ibo, anything you want to add, or anybody else? If you just go down to the bottom of the box there, reactions, put your hand up. I'll be very happy to take a question or comment. Hugo, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for organizing this this platform, and also thanks a lot to the very profound presentations by everybody, and also I think the discussion about political will. And I also want to sort of flip that a bit to the European creditor side, because what I find very interesting is sort of the comment made by the speakers also on the fact that we've seen previous processes like Lima, but also previous re-engagement attempts. And I must say that sometimes it seems that the current creditors and diplomats tend to think this is a new thing and forgetting about these processes and also the lessons learned. And I agree that with the analysis that the lessons learned to a large extent is the lesson of lack of political will. And then I also would say, like, and I question them, what are your strategies in terms of when we see the same thing happening? And my question is mostly to Janet, but also to others. I really like how you pointed to some of the shortcomings of the process in terms of parliament representation, but also the fact about the debt audit, which I think is something that ZIMCOT has been advocating for a long time. And I think this whole process is a matter of testing political will. So to what extent is there an appetite by the creditor side or European diplomat side to put in the debt audit as a thing on the table, one, to the Zim government, but also something that we have asked them in the past for the reverse debt audit. So for them basically to come out in the open and show that these are, this is what we have and this is what we're talking from. So I would be quite interested to hear how they respond to that, and also how they respond to the question of inclusivity of the process. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hugo. Comment from Chennai, and Janet unfortunately has to leave us. She's got domestic duties, but Musa and Chennai, think about that one. Anybody else have any comments or observations? We're coming to the end there. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. Ibo, any comments? But if nothing from you, perhaps Chennai and Musa, you might respond to Hugo. The question really is about what is the position of the international community on this? I suppose yeah, Chennai, go ahead.
Tony, I think obviously Janet would be in the room in terms of really picking up what the responses have been from their communities, but we've got to respect the sovereign nature of all governance, which is that they play to their taxpayers, right? So if we are going and asking for relief, if we are asking for support, it has to be justifiable by them to their stakeholders, who are their taxpayers. So it would not make sense for them to offer some relief or support to a country that is run by a government that will not investigate corruption, that will openly participate in corrupt activities, and so on and so forth. So we really need to reform before anybody can take us seriously. We may continue, of course, to get the relief that is needed from a social welfare perspective, but insofar as properly and fully addressing the debt question, then we are a long way away before we can start really to have serious conversations on this and really start to have meaningful contribution from foreign governments insofar as this is concerned. I think I was just also asking in terms of the voters' role, for instance, you know, there are some, it's as if I was to simplify it, right? If you have, you know, the problem child, if you like, and you want to help them get out of their situation, you can only do it if they also show commitment to the same objective. And at the moment, there isn't. I mean, we've been going on about the voters' roll, for instance, of which people, you know, we've turned it into an election issue. But the voters' roll, it points to the credit risk of the country. You know, at the moment, in terms of our SME development, borrowing and securing lending is very difficult because of we cannot properly risk profile, you know, businesses. And the voters' roll would go a long way in supporting that in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. So there continues to be evidence of the government not really focusing on real long-lasting economic development. We hear some ramblings through this period, obviously, because of the elections, when there's a little bit of spotlight, you know, we will get national strategies and so on and so forth. But for all intents and purposes, the political will, which is absolutely critical for this, is missing and continues to be missing. So I'm afraid we are stuck where we are, and things can only get worse and not better.
Well, thank you. That was very right, precise to the point. Musa, any last comments from you?
Yeah, well, to the point around the reaction of the international community, my understanding is that this process started initially as a closed-door engagement between the government and a few creditors, and it was then expanded to include virtually every other creditor we have in the country, until the process was then opened publicly to include other stakeholders in the country, including civil society, farmers, business, etc., because of the nature of the reform agenda that would be needed. In my view, the focus really is not on the dollars and cents, but on the reform. And the issue of sincerity then becomes extremely, extremely important. The attitude of the creditors, as I understand, is not to say we don't want to provide relief to Zimbabwe. The attitude is to say we want to, but provided these conditions are met. So it's a conditional kind of arrangement. So it all then boils down to sincerity on the part of the Zimbabwean government, and sincerity will be measured not in words, but in the actual practical, tangible steps that would be taken. The kind of laws that we are passing, whether those will be signed and gazetted, promulgated into applicable law. The kind of promises that we have made around peaceful elections, free and fair polls, etc., whether we will actually live to those things. So for me, my last word would be, this is an opportunity provided there is sincerity, and I think it's our duty, those of us in civil society, political parties in parliament, business, citizens at large, to try and pin the government and hold the government to its commitments, because they have already accepted these matrices, meaning they have made those commitments. And we are served better as citizens if we are able to push the government to abide by its commitments, because at the end of the day, those reforms are meant to benefit us, not the international creditors. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Musa. Well, as moderator, I've been sitting here scribbling notes like a maniac, trying to digest this. It's always one of the horrible tasks of being moderator. But you have to synthesize some things about this. So the topic was debt relief, ZIDERA, and elections. And I want to take you back to the two quotes I had at the beginning, one by Adesina and by Joaquim Chissano. Chissano said, "You're a regional problem." Adesina said, "Let's have lots of reforms and they will lead to peaceful, free and fair elections." Now, those were very instructive comments. My take on this is that pulling words out of this dialogue, we use words like low-hanging fruit, low bar, and I would add to that stability. So my take on this debt relief initiative, it's an initiative by the region, by, if you want, government, the region, and some of the international community to ensure stability. The low-hanging fruit is not the election, it's to go past the election and to carry on the debt relief process. The low bar is to accept the election in whatever format it is and to continue with the debt relief process. And so where does this leave us? You know, my only personal hope, and then I'm going to hand it over to Iba, is this is the first time for a very long time that Zimbabwe has had something that looks like a discussion about a political settlement. A political settlement that is desperately needed. When Chennai said we need a change of government, the question is, do we need a change of government or do we need a change of process? And we go back to comments that we've made in this policy dialogue endlessly, and that is that the need for political settlement, national dialogue, which we're having in part, and a transition is critical. Thank you to Janet, thank you to Chennai, thank you to Musa. I'd like to hand over to Ibo in Accra, and I hope he's happy there. Ibo, last words to you.
Well, thanks, Tony. I listened with much interest. I'm sorry I was not able to be as participative as I would like to have been, being a guest in Accra, Ghana. But all I have to say is that there's an enormous tension between, on the one hand, the kind of discussions we've been having, the extent to which, inadvertently or otherwise, the forthcoming election, which is only less than 60 days away, has become a litmus test with respect to the issues that we're discussing, debt, ZIDERA, and so forth, on the one hand. And on the other, the impression that I have of that we're hurtling to the precipice, in which case we can say almost with confidence that we'll have history repeating itself. The elections, which have become litmus tests, are likely to be even more than before disputed. We have never had so much drama, pre-election drama, like we've had even on nomination day itself. And yet, curiously, the parties that be, especially the opposition, have thrown caution to the wind, notwithstanding the various flaws, the various pillars we discussed, being lending themselves to a disputed election. They've decided to go ahead anyway, in the face of a faulty delimitation process, a faulty voters' roll, a faulty nomination, the interference of the state agencies in the process, and so on and so forth. So in for a drama. And without we're wishing to be negative, we watch with enormous interest in the weeks ahead. And therefore, for our next dialogue on the 7th of July, I would like to look at our so-called presidential candidates. Would hope to have at least the polling agents or the election agents of the three main contenders in a discussion, so that Zimbabweans and regional opinion makers and in the international community can make their own assessment of the persons involved. So until then, I want to thank Tony, Musa, Chennai, and Janet for this